Can you please say your name, age, and where you're located?
Yes, my name is Johnson, and I am 34 years old. I am located in Mississippi, United States.
And in terms of your story, where would be the best place to start?
Well, like most everybody else, I was born. I was born in 1989. I was born in Romania. My earliest memory was of my mother. I remember her getting my stepfather's attention and saying, "Look, he's crawling." That's probably my earliest memory. I grew up in Romania for about 8 years or so. And I didn't know my real father. From what I remember my mother telling me, I had a ridiculous amount of brothers and sisters, like 12 brothers and 6 sisters. And supposedly my father took them and left when I was born. It was always confusing to me, and I didn't really ever understand why, but it happened. For about 8 years of my life, she lived with what I referred to as my stepfather. My stepfather was a Romanian who wasn't a very good man. He was a drunk, and he beat me and my mother a lot. At one point, he even took the back of an axe to my head. It was a nightly thing. He would go to work all day, then he would go drink, sometimes so much that my mother would have to leave me and my step brother and sister there in the apartment and go hunt him down and find him. And sometimes wouldn't return until really late at night. He was so abusive that sometimes he would make me stand all night staring out the window just to keep me awake. And I guess torture is technically the right word, but I don't remember what he was trying to accomplish with it other than to try to keep me awake all night and sort of punish me. He even threw me out of the apartment naked, and it was a 4-story apartment building. Naked, and a couple of times some of the neighbors, or the neighbor, who I remember her husband had to be some sort of a firefighter or something because he was heavily burned on one side of his body, but he was a big man and a strong man. And he wasn't there during the day. He still worked. She would pull me in a couple of times and clothe me, feed me, and give me some stuff. And it got to the point to where at one point she showed me where the police station was. My stepfather and mother would fight a lot. And at what point said, "He's not mine. Those two are mine." And my mother would say, "Oh no, they're all mine. They all came from me." But yet I, as a kid who was under 8 years old, was charged with watching the other two. An accident happened. As most kids, I was curious, and I sometimes wandered around. And I didn't sit there and watch my brothers and sisters all the time. Well, Romania had radiators to warm the house. I know a lot of Europe still does, but these radiators were big cast iron radiators that were right in front of the window. My stepbrother, climbed on the radiator one day, and the window was open, and he fell 4 stories. And these buildings are old and very tall. At least by U.S. standards, these were 6 to 8 story tall buildings versus, what normal 4-story buildings look like nowadays. My stepbrother broke his neck, and I felt bad, but let's just say after that, the beatings from my stepfather increased heavily. After about the 3rd time of me by myself, the first time the neighbor showed me where the police station was. After about the 3rd time of me going to the police station, basically saying, please help me and my mom, the police intervened. He went to jail all 3 times and stayed there longer and longer and longer, but in the end, they let him go after a few days, usually. Then the state of Romania, the orphanage, stepped in, took me, and I spent a couple of years about a year or so in the orphanage.
Can I ask as well, in terms of what was going on with your stepdad, how did your mum respond to what was going on?
Well, my mother loved me. I only remember my mother smacking or hitting me once. And I still remember that apology. Gave the biggest, most tearful apology. And she was sobbing and crying and hugging me and apologizing. I kind of get where a lot of people go with this, but she couldn't leave. She could have left. Romania, it was, even though it had been a few years since the war had ended, Romania was still a blown up, torn up mess where I was. We had a playground. Just for the best example, we had a playground outside the apartment buildings that we couldn't play on. It looked like the military just came through and blew the thing up. Even the slides, they were tall slides, and all the ladder rungs were missing. Merry-go-round was just, the small kid merry-go-rounds were just trashed. So she had a mom and dad out in the country, but for whatever reason, she could not leave, and the grandparents out in the country, there was some sort of divide there to where they did not like her or want her around for some reason. They grew corn.
So it sounds like it was quite difficult for your mum to leave with what was going on at the time, and then also it sounds like she was quite isolated as well.
Yes. Not that if she didn't try hard enough that she couldn't leave, but it was not, for whatever reason, it was not an easy situation to do. And she, at the very least, even though I'm very sympathetic towards her, at the very least, she kept a roof over our heads, which the roof we had was not all that great, but anyway, from there I went to the orphanage. A lot of these events in my early childhood, I remember a lot of scenes, but the timeline's a little fuzzy. I know I spent at least a year in the orphanage because I had a summer and I had a Christmas there. The orphanage was okay. Got roughed up a little bit. We went to school. The school was actually worse than the orphanage. But in the end, there was a kid there at the orphanage that got adopted by a German family. And he later wrote back and said, "Hey, this is what I have. These are the cool parents I have," and basically just kind of showed off a little bit and showed off his toys and his room. And in the end, I basically went to the headmaster of the orphanage and said, "I want to get adopted too." Well, her secretary heard about it. Heard it. She was in the next room. And that secretary told my current adopted aunt, who lives in Hungary. My aunt was visiting over here, and she told my adopted parents. And
okay, I'm just gonna quickly ask, but I know, like, being an adoptee, when I say parents, I refer to my adoptive parents. Is that the same for you? So when you're
usually, yeah, I don't typically say adopted parents. I just refer to them as my parents to make it easy.
yeah.
But they are my adopted parents. There's a lot of rife there, and I'll explain a lot of it. But yeah.
Can I ask another question as well? Sorry to jump back a little bit, but in terms of, with my experience with being an adoptee, I was in a foster home, but I'm wondering what an orphanage looks like in comparison. Like, what does that look like?
Okay, so the orphanage was packed with people. It was just a massive rectangular building, and that I actually found in recent years. Massive rectangular building that had just tons of rooms in them. It was about 4 to 6 stories tall, and with a long hallway. You came in the building on one side, and it had a long hallway, and each side had its own, or the whole thing had its own room, and it had a concrete and asphalt soccer field. And the second building was the cafeteria, and it was at least a 2-story. We don't ever know what they did downstairs, probably the kitchen, but upstairs is where the main cafeteria was. And it was just packed with people, and there were beds right next to each other. Sometimes you had room, but there were twin beds side by side by side by side in each room. I remember the first night I was there, I was sleeping, and I had one guy on top of me trying to do something. And I woke up out of fright, and he ran across the beds just to get back to his bed. But it was packed. You had a day room where everybody watched TV and packed in like sardines, but it was full.
Thank you for explaining. Sounds very, very different to like foster families. And I hadn't heard anything really about what an orphanage looks like, so that's really insightful to hear.
Yeah. Well, now keep in mind there's a lot of events here that are still pretty important in my life that I'm skipping over. But
okay.
Basically when I asked to be adopted, the first thing I noticed was they swapped me from my classroom into another classroom. Typically in Romania, the way it worked when I was there, if the whole class graduated or passed the grade, the whole grade would keep the same teacher, the same classroom, and they would go on to the second grade. So the next year you would come back to the exact same room with the exact same teacher teaching the next grade up. Well, they swapped me to another class. I don't know if I failed the class or if they swapped me for a different purpose, but a few months after I swapped, they had an English teacher come in to attempt to start teaching English. Didn't make it very long. They didn't teach all that much, just a few basic things. Then I went to a foster family there in Romania, and they tried to instill the idea of a family back into my life. Now, they too were a little bit abusive, but it wasn't that bad, and it was not anything compared to what I came from. It wasn't anything that I wasn't used to. So there was a major lack of love, and it was just brusque and just trying to learn table manners. It wasn't anything heavy. And then after that, one day the authorities came. They put me in a car and drove me several hours to Bucharest. I'm from Slovakia. That's where I met my parents for the first time. And then we took a couple of hour ride train to Hungary and met my aunt for the first time. I flew from Romania and landed on U.S. soil on my 10th birthday. From there, the training began. Whoever I was before was killed. And my adoptive parents had a child already that they adopted from the United States. She was the first. I and the girl that was adopted with me was child number 2 and 3. They mostly focused on the girl that was adopted with me. Now, I do not believe they read the primal wound or did enough research, because they encountered a girl with issues. I have them too, but they were a lot worse than mine. And let's just say after about a year, they gave the girl away to another family, not in my local area. From my understanding, she was a military they were a military family.
So you've gone from being in your birth family to an orphanage to a foster family to the US, and then you've become like attached to your new sister, and then she's removed and placed in another family, is that right?
Right.
All before what age? Roughly, like 11?
Before 11, yeah.
That's a lot of huge, like, major life events and changes.
Well, she and I socialized because we came from the same country. But as far as her and I liking being brother and sister, there wasn't much there because, again, I wasn't used to having this kind of social dynamic. So it didn't, by this point in time, it didn't matter how many people you picked up out of in my life, and just, I could have passed through a million people and probably wouldn't have noticed a difference.
Wow, okay.
But after she was given away, the focus of my adoptive family turned on to me. My mother used to brag, and still does from time to time, that my first sister, and for the purposes of this video, I'm going to refer to her as my sister, my adoptive sister. She didn't like how she used to whine like a baby when she wanted something. So she, being the college-educated woman that she was, taught my sister sign language instead of learning what the baby actually wanted. Well, they did the same to me. They didn't teach me sign language, but whoever I was before, they pretty much killed off and said Romanian no more, and taught me American everything, to include the language. My entire life was on a very short leash, and they were the type that felt that family reputation mattered. Even with, like, my adoptive grandparents or other family, I was not really allowed to have a relationship with. And I could converse with them and talk with them, but basically mom and dad were in the room. I never had a family relationship at all. Even when my grandparents died, I was surprised I got anything from them. But it was mainly my mother, who was in charge of the estate by this point, who got me one thing that my grandparents had. My sister was treated like the queen. She had everything. She was spoiled, received the whole red carpet, had friends, had birthday parties, had, even to this day, I mean, she was recently basically given a house by my parents. She got the royal treatment, and I got treated like scum. Throughout my life with my adopted parents, I felt like I was pretty much on lockdown. I was never allowed to have friends, and the ones that I was allowed to have, it's funny because my family had to meet them and get to know them and know them very well to even consider. And I am not, I'm not trying to say anything negative about the LGBTQ community or anything like that, but my adoptive parents were Christians who believed in traditional values, but they didn't, especially my mother. She pretty much ran the house. And if you believed everything she told you about her, she was better. She was a saint. She was better than the Virgin Mary herself, if you were dumb enough to believe it. But even the Bible itself tells you that everybody is a sinner, and even from the womb. Well, I was not allowed to like girls, and when it came to even to girlfriends, not allowed. When it came to friends, they had to be vetted and approved. And ironically, the ones that my parents approved of the most, especially my mother, the ones she approved of the most, turned out to be gay. And I don't have anything against those people. It wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what I was after. So, my entire life.
Oh, sorry.
What was that? No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, in terms of your parents having to pretty much vet everyone that you were going to see, if you were allowed to go and see them, or with you not being allowed to like girls as well, how did that affect your social relationships growing up, especially as a teenager?
Well, it actually, that still affects me to this day. I wasn't allowed to participate in anything, so I didn't know how to really do anything. Dances, I wasn't allowed to go to. Friends, I wasn't allowed to have, while my sister was allowed to have all the friends she wanted. Birthday parties, for me, were a sham. For my sister, it was the whole 9 yards was pulled out. It was bad, and it actually hindered me a lot. One thing I didn't cover is one of the things my stepfather did do. Stepfather in Romania did do. We went to one of his friends' houses one day, and his friend had two houses. It was the main house, then there was this guest house off to the side. And at the guest house, I had my first girl encounter there. And my stepfather also had some adult magazines laying around that I had gotten into when he wasn't there. I think if it wasn't for that, even to this day, I wouldn't be interested in girls. Especially with how my life has gone. Typically, I had a lot of trouble socializing with people. To this day, my friend list is not very big. I have a few friends, but it's not very big. Even with like father figures type people, I always try too hard to do something to make them proud. And typically it backfires, and usually it goes two ways. One, I either try too hard and overstep, or two, I don't try hard enough and relationships just don't flourish. And I'm always stuck in this life where I have to bottle everything up. My adopted life was miserable. And that my parents were always worried about the reputation. They didn't really care about anything else. They just wanted you to be a good representation of them. And if you represent them well, oh, they're quick to claim you. But if you don't do something they approve of, they just shun you and don't really approve of what you do, who you are, what you say. Heck, my father won't even claim me as his son most of the time, unless I'm basically standing there, or I say or do something that makes him look good. They had a business. They had multiple businesses. I wasn't allowed to really be part of the business. I was just labor whenever they felt like using me for labor. And my sister got, yet again, everything. She's a part of the business. I never really was. Sometimes they throw me a bone to do something for them, but typically, no. To them, I'm pretty much a nobody. Recently, my mother posted something on Facebook, a very old photo from the past, and I told her the truth in one of the comments, and she blocked me for telling how I felt and telling the truth. Typically, I was there to, I hate to use this word, be their slave. They constantly had me doing a lot of things for them. They had me there for them to do a lot of things, whether it was chores, cut grass, make them look good, be a good representation of them. The whole savior type complex.
Can I ask as well? I'm just curious, but did you ever get like the "you owe me" kind of attitude? Like, I took you from this life and put you in this life, so now, you have to do these things or meet these standards or behave a certain way. Did that ever?
Absolutely, the entire life. And later on, I'm going to tell you that I ran away from home. But basically, at one point, my father, and they played that card a lot, whether they actually used it or not. They played that card very subtly and quite a bit. And my father asked me, so what is it that you think I owe you? Well, as a kid, I gave a lot of short answers, dumb answers, and gave answers like why. Very short, stupid answers. For example, one time they asked me, why do you think we adopted you? And I said, to cut your grass. Because as a child, that's what I thought. What he owed me, though, and still does, is love. If you take that responsibility, then I am owed the love of a father. And I don't mean just the tough love, but all of it. At one point, he apologized to me for not singing me a song like he used to my sister at night, like when we were tucked in bed and put to bed. As a 10-year-old, I asked, where's my song? And he never did. He just kind of laughed it off, and it was nothing. Well, it wasn't the song. It was love. And they didn't love me like they did my sister. And there's the proof here is a lifetime of treatment. How they treated my sister and how they treated me were two totally separate night and day things. It was so bad that I didn't mind getting in trouble. Getting in trouble was a relief. Now, I didn't get in trouble or do things that got me in trouble because I wanted to be an evil kid and I wanted to get their attention. Getting in trouble was more of a relief and a break than the stranglehold that they had on me and the way they were constantly suffocating me and telling me what I could and couldn't do and constantly just keeping me in a box. My mother, she used to laugh about, and still does to this day, oh, we knew we were doing damage and we knew we were going to have to pay for therapy when you grew up.
That's so bad.
Yeah. And the thing is, on paper, they're the perfect family. They're the family that if they went to an adoption agency today, they could still get more kids if they wanted to. And they're in the church. I'm not knocking Christianity. What Christianity stands for and does is amazing. Christians aren't the bad guys, but they were children's pastors who couldn't have kids and they went and adopted. There was a lot of hypocrisy that happened, you know. They said one thing but did another, and they still do it now. So friends and relationships really suffered, even close family. Probably the one I had the most problem with, the only relationships that were allowed were mother and father. Outside world was basically just not allowed in. I was taken from Romania. I was taken from one prison cell and put into another, and it was their prison cell. Now, in this prison, I was not beat, but in this prison, I was only allowed to say and do certain things and act certain ways. And everything was just miserable. And my sister got most of their love, while I didn't. Now, on paper, they look great, and they even took us to Disneyland, right? But whenever they took us to Disneyland, it wasn't for me. It was mainly for my sister. At Disneyland, there was really only one ride I wanted to ride, and that was a roller coaster. And we were lucky if we rode it 2 or 3 times. Really, we were lucky if we rode it twice because it was such a long line. We were mostly there for my sister and what she wanted to do. We watched a lot of the animal shows and Shamu and everything at SeaWorld. It was never really about me. It was really more about her and pretty much my entire life. Not only that, she was my mother's favorite. So she was 8 years younger than me and would constantly tattletale and tell everything that I was doing that I wasn't supposed to. It was my own personal alarm system, bodyguard, so on and so forth. But my mother had this very bad, she had a bunch of bad habits, but one of them, she would talk to different people in the family. She would talk to some of my aunts. She would talk to my grandparents, sometimes almost on a nightly basis. And she would go into her master bedroom that was fairly close to mine. And the walls were not as soundproof as she thought. And almost every night it was, "Oh my gosh, you won't believe what he did today. Can you believe he would say that or do that?" And it was just a constant discouragement. And I was the devil all the time. And it got to the point to where, okay, well, if I'm that bad of a son and that horrible and that big of a monster, fine, I'll be the person you're claiming I am. And it's funny because even my father, he had a troubled life too. He managed to turn it around. He had a father that didn't really love him as much as he should have either. But he would understand things, but he wouldn't stick up for me at all. He just let my mother run the house in the way she wanted it to run. And I was always the bad guy. And when it comes to competing with my father over devious things that we do or have done, I was either never good enough, in other words, not as good as him. But if I stepped over the threshold of what he did, then all of a sudden I'm a monster. How could you? Now, I haven't committed murders or done anything like that. My life was so bad that at one point, you know how kids and teenagers say things they don't mean. At one point I said, "I wish you hadn't adopted me." I said that to my mother. And from that point forward, it was about when I was 12 or 13. She said, "Well, when you turn 18, you can pack up your stuff and leave." And she kept that going in my head for another 4 years. And it got to the point where I believed it. I believed that when I was 18, I was leaving. Whether I wanted to leave or whether she wanted me to leave, I was leaving. Well, I couldn't wait till 18, so I ran away when I was 16. They were sitting there watching me in which direction I went. They called the police and said I was disturbing the family peace. Now, the judge at the local juvenile center could not keep me more than 90 days. He kept me there for 2 weeks purely because I didn't want to go home. And I made it about 4 miles on foot before I finally got caught. And it was midnight.
Wow. So rather than checking into what was going on or getting you support, you were punished for it.
And this section of this country is very, very notorious for that. They are heavily into brutalizing and beating people into submission. My father brags all the time about his grandfather. My grandfather on my father's side is adopted from Panama. My father brags about his white grandfather putting black guys in an elevator and taking them up and down and beating them because it was easier to beat them with a club and letting them go than it was to charge them with stuff, basically book them and charge them with stuff. And
I'm just hearing that's from my perspective, and I think a lot of people's is quite messed up, but I can only imagine also being a young person hearing that by your caregiver who's supposed to keep you safe and look after you.
Yep. Most of my troubles, as far as when I got in trouble, it was mostly just fighting at school or stealing. Not proud of it to this day. Really, really not proud of it in anybody I've harmed. I apologize. And if you see me and know me, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right between you and me. I apologize for my actions, and I'm willing to do the right thing. That being said, there was a lot more going on, and I didn't care if I got in trouble, because anything that happened to me was easier and better than the freedom that I had in my own house.
There's something that, oh sorry, this just reminds me of something that because my upbringing was a bit messy as well, and something that I've talked to my siblings about, like, as we've gotten older, is kind of like when you grow up in those environments where there's a lot of control, or if there's abuse going on, anything like that, sometimes like you have all these pent up emotions and then they've got to come out somehow, like, or you have to have control over something, or you can't just keep it in, so it comes out in weird ways. But if you had been in like another environment where it's healthier, then you would have had healthier coping mechanisms, and it wouldn't have come out necessarily in the ways that it does. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and actually this kind of goes hand in hand with another question that you had earlier. How did it affect my social life? Well, because I wasn't allowed to have friends and wasn't allowed to converse, I didn't know how to converse and socialize and talk. So when it came to the social dynamic in the school and who I could hang out with, typically the people that were getting in trouble and were the so-called scum of the earth type of people, they were the ones that I gravitated towards. And the reason for that was A, they were willing to be friends with me, but B, they did not judge as harshly, or really at all. They were judgment free. And the goody two shoes type of people, like my parents, judged everything, every little thing. Even talking to my mother would sit there after school, make me stand in front of her and tell her everything I did all day. And I would. But it was more of a rundown list. At 8 o'clock, I did math. At 9 o'clock, I did social studies, so on and so forth. And she would have to use her words, pry teeth, which try to get stuff out of me about how my day went and who I was hanging out with and talking to and so on and so forth. But when I was a kid, cussing in that kind of group of people was a very common thing. And it also showed that you were tough. And I kind of grew up with that kind of a life in general. But with my mother, I couldn't cuss in front of her, or I would get in even more trouble. And then my father would have something to say about it, and he could get physical. He didn't typically get physical, but he could get physical. So I refused generally to talk to her a lot, mainly because if I talked to her and tried to share things with her, I did not have the freedom, as you said, to do so. And if I did say or do the wrong thing, I just got into more trouble, and it was just more problems in the house. And it was just more problems for me. So really, when I got in trouble, I typically, it was one of those things where I would analyze whether it was worth it to do something or not. Like fighting. Is it worth it to fight? Yeah, it makes me look good in the school. I gain some popularity. I'm cool. And I really don't care what happens at home. There's not much more they can do to me. But if it made my life real hard at home, then I tended to like cussing from my mother. She would have slapped me or had my father, even when I was young, spank me. I wouldn't do those kind of things. But if I was grounded from something, it was really hard for them to ground me from anything because I didn't really care about that much in my life. I didn't have anything that was motivating enough to lose. So, yeah, it was strict.
I'm really curious as well, and I imagine it might be something that you'll touch on or talk about, but how your relationship with your parents kind of evolved and how it is now as well.
Well, my mother played the same pretty much my entire life, and it got to the point to where I just didn't believe it anymore. But my sister was the favorite, and she got everything from my mother. Even when my sister bought a car for the very first time from a dealer, brand new, she basically told my sister to use my grandfather as the co-signer. She never did that kind of thing for me. Had a closer relationship with my father. My mother, it was distant, very distant. We didn't like each other, and she, throughout the years, has tried to reach out and sort of not really mend things, because she never really wanted to mend or take accountability for anything. She would always tell me, you should quit blaming others and take accountability. But she wouldn't do it. And she was always very manipulative and conniving. And at one point, even when I was in school, I showed her that I was better at it than she was. And oh my God, that drove her up the wall. She was bad. Now, my father typically tried to treat me like a human. But my mother, on the other hand, not so much. My father would pull up in front of the school, the dog sitting in the front seat. He'd tell the dog to get in the back seat while I got in the front seat in front of everyone, right? My mother, no. Dog's a good girl. She sits here. You get in the back. And I'm sure if she could, she'd throw me in the trunk. But it was never good. Throughout the years, as growing up, conversing with an adult versus conversing with a kid is different. But typically, she treated my 8-year-old sister, she and I were 8 years apart. She treated my 8-year-old sister like she was 18, while I got treated like I was 8. And it was just... It's
degrading.
Never good. And she'll point to a lot of the individual things I did wrong, but I promise you, I've got something for... Not that I have an excuse, but I have something for every single thing that I've done. But they don't ever care to see it from my shoes. They only care to see it from their perspective, and I just need to get over it and be grateful about it. Grow up. So, after 6 years of being in their house, I was kicked out on the streets, and they were going to put me in a halfway house of a ministry that they knew. With that halfway house, they use a lot of people from those halfway houses as labor. for their businesses. And I was basically going to have to come back to them groveling and asking for help. And I was always going to have to, it's always been about a control thing. I was always going to have to ask them for help in my life. And they were always going to control me one way or another. You want X, then you got to do B. And that was going to go on even into my adulthood. And instead, I went to a military academy. And then from there, I went directly from the military academy into the Army. I was trying to get into the Marines, but they would not take me. They wanted people that didn't need permission from their parents to go. I had to ask them, pretty much beg them for permission to sign the slip so I could go into the Army. And it really didn't matter whether they did or not. 6 months after I got out, I would have been 18 anyway, and I would have gone on regardless. But even in the military, I had trouble with relationships. I had trouble forming relationships. Now I have some, but trying to form relationships with people, and whether it's friends or father figures or any of it, it just didn't work, even after the military. But my relationship with my parents now is currently, it fluctuates heavily. Some seasons they're good, other seasons they're very, very bad. Right now it's a bad season. My parents and I haven't spoken in quite a while. The last thing that I said to them was the comment on that picture about my childhood from the past. And my mother did not like the comment because it made her look bad. And she blocked me. So did my sister. My sister has always been the person that, sucked up to my mom. And sister and I hardly ever talk anyway. But she actually blocked me when that happened. My father, let's just say he's made promises all my life and has kept very few of them, if any. The last thing he told me was, when I fix, he has an old car. It's a GTO, but when I fix the GTO, I'm going to drive it up there and have lunch with you. It's been months, if not a year, since that happened. I can't count on them. Since I've gotten out of the military, they've used me for their business ventures. He specifically has always hooked me up with people that have shafted him. And then I go do business with them, and turns out that there's bad blood, and they either won't do business with me because they had bad encounters with my father. And I don't know it, and I look like the dummy trying to help some guy out with money. Or they hand me over to some of their business constituents. And I spent to basically help them out. I spend money with them. I spend my money with them, and in turn, they get something out of it later. But long story short, a lot of things have been strained heavily, and I won't deal with it. It's funny because my sister was the favorite, still is, but I'm the only kid with a grandkid. And at times they've used that to say, yeah, well, we're grandparents. You know, they're grandparents in the same manner a deadbeat dad is a dad.
I'm curious as well, do your parents ever use your child as a reason why you should be in contact with them?
Yes, they have. First off, we haven't seen them in quite a while now. But there was a point in time when my son ran off with his grandfather to go do things. And turned out that Grandpa was just asking a lot of questions. And I had to start going with him. And at some point, stop my son from saying certain things just to not give them another foothold of something to control. One of the big things that I have had issues with them, especially when I try to ask them about the past, for example, and sort out things from the past.
Do you mean before you were adopted, or do you mean like when you talk about past, what do you mean, sorry?
Okay, so I'm a grown man now, I'm 34 years old. When I tried to hash out issues that I had with them in the past and how they raised me and things that I needed, the very ironic part, right? They tell me that you didn't do what we told you, so that's what you get. Well, when I was asking for things like friends, to make friends, to socialize, to do things that would give me a leg up in life now, they just denied them and would not teach me how to get them, receive them, so on and so forth. When I try to hash out issues from when they adopted me and things that they did wrong, and they know they did wrong, they won't talk about it. I'll say something, you know, the damage, the so-called damage that we talked about earlier. When damage rears its ugly head through me, all you hear from them is crickets. It's like they take the moral, as Christians, it's like they take the moral high ground road, keep their mouth shut, and don't talk or hash anything out that caused issues. They just leave you there to rot. And you're done. You constantly have problems that you can't get over. I tried to do therapy when I was younger, but in the end, I ended up seeing it as a joke. I went into the therapy session and I was told, this is what's going to happen. You tell me and I won't tell your parents. And I bought it. The first time I bought it and I trusted it. Then they brought my parents in, sat them down, and told them everything I just told the counselor. Now, this was not the type of thing where I was going to harm myself or others. This was me fully trusting them. And when they did that, I shut down. And I did not tell them anything else. I literally wasted my family's money for the next 8 to 10 sessions. I don't remember how many it was. Just because I could not trust them.
I was going to ask as well, with your experiences and with the trauma that you've experienced as well, what your views on adoption are and around the system.
Well, I had one kid. And I haven't, when I talked to my wife about another one, we figured that if we wanted another kid in the future, that we would just adopt. Although based on the experiences I had as a kid, there's a reason I only had one. Because I didn't want the same neglect, problems, and issues I had on another kid. So if we're going to have a kid, I'm for just having one kid and spoiling the one kid. I don't agree with adoption. The idea behind adoption is great. In my opinion, it's better than abortion. But the system doesn't work. The reason my wife and I are so great is because she understands the brokenness of an adoption family. And I'm closer to my wife than I am to my own adopted family. She's great. I think, for adoption's sake, if it continues, I'm going to be against it with the current system. But the idea of it sounds great, but it needs a lot more monitoring. The state itself needed to do more check-ins and more monitoring on what was going on in my house. On paper, they were great. They were amazing people. They still are. But when it came to the love that was given, the love for me was lacking. Even though they told me they loved me, it was lacking heavily. And the proof is in a lot of things that they did and didn't do. What they did with my sister and what they did with me. Even when it came to like my mother, my original birth, my mother, my original birth mother, they refused to give me the papers that told me about it. They always used it as a control mechanism. They told me, oh, if you graduate high school and go to college, we will give you the free trip to Romania so you can go find your mother. Well, I left high school early. I got my graduation early, so they didn't like how I did it. They didn't give it to me. Every time I asked for the papers, my father would say, go ask your mother. And my mother would always give me an excuse. And the primary excuse was, well, it's got important information in there that I can't give you, like our social security number. You know, in this country, I was not a fan of President Obama. But one of the greatest things President Obama ever did was expanded the Freedom of Information Act. That Freedom of Information Act gave me the capability to go take those papers from the Department of Immigration. And I have them now, along with my mother's social security number, which she claimed was oh so important. Now, I could ruin her life, but I'm not, and I haven't. But her excuses are trash. I played ball with them as best as I could. I asked nicely, and I waited a while and asked nicely. And after 3 times, I had enough. And, I may not have everything they have, because I know that they've given me presents before, like a tablecloth from Romania. So I may not have everything they have, but I have all the information I need. And the rest doesn't really matter. I'd love to have it someday, and I don't know if I'll even get it. At one point, my mother told me that I told her once I was not expecting anything from her when she died. And she said, that's a good choice. So, even when they die, I may not even go to the funeral, because the love there is missing, and there's nothing for me there. The fact that I even got a relic from my grandfather was, in my opinion, a miracle. So I have all my papers, and luckily it's to a president that I appreciate. I didn't think everything he did was amazing, but for that part and that part alone, I appreciate what he did.
Yeah. Can I also just build on something you said earlier as well, for anyone that watches this, but in terms of adoptive parents looking good on paper, I think it's not just isolated to where you are, because for example, in my situation, that's a whole nother country and the same thing's happening. So I think the issue is actually huge and really needs to be looked into. Why is it important to you that you share your story?
Adoption is painted to be a good thing, a savior type complex, which the idea of it on paper sounds amazing. And to everybody that has had amazing parents that were outstanding, to the people that were like my sister and had the parents that gave them everything, I am happy for you. I really am. But with social media and podcasts and so on and so forth, it seems like more and more people have more issues than positive experiences. A lot of this still needs work. With my parents being basically perfect on paper, there were still a lot of troubles. Point is, there's still a lot of issues that we are having. And it's coming out of the woodwork now that we've had a whole generation of adoptees that have grown up seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the truth is, we need more intervention and more regulation. Me personally, today, I am not an advocate for adoption. The idea of it sounds great, but I would not suggest adoption. Not until you do so much research that you see from people like me the problems that can arise.
If you were going to say anything to someone who's going through a similar situation to what you went through, or that is relating to anything that you're saying, what would your advice be to them?
Really, that depends on who you are. But if you are in my exact shoes, keep your head up. Aim for something good. Find your own path in life and go help others. And I know that's hard to say or do. But aim for something better. And always do what's right, even when it's difficult. If you're in this situation, it's not going to last forever. The season will change. Go on to the next season and chase something great.